Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Installing VMware vCenter 5 as a Linux Appliance, or the vCSA. In this lesson, I'll be answering the question, what is the vCenter Server Appliance? I'll cover the pros and cons to using vCenter as an appliance, and then I'll show you how to deploy vCenter Server 5 using the new appliance mode. Finally, I'll end the lesson by showing you how to test vCSA using the vSphere client. So with that, let's get started. So what is the vCenter Server Appliance? Well, it's also called the vCSA. That stands for vCenter Server Appliance, and it's a new option for deploying vCenter with vSphere 5. What it is a Linux-based virtual machine that's optimized for running vCenter Server. And it has not only Linux pre-installed, but also a version of vCenter that's compatible with Linux and is fully functional, or just about fully functional, in your vSphere virtual environment with vSphere 5. Now, don't worry if you're not familiar with Linux. No Linux knowledge is required. And the cool thing is that no installation of Linux or even vCenter has to be performed. By far, it's the fastest way to get vSphere 5 up and running. And the cool thing is that there's no additional cost to using this method, of course, assuming you've already purchased vSphere and vCenter. Now let's talk about the pros and cons to using vCenter as an appliance. Well, first off, the pros, the good things about using vCenter in this new way. Well, it supports all traditional vCenter server features like DRS, the new SDRS, or Storage Distributed Resource Scheduler, VMHA, host profiles, the distributed virtual switch, and more. Also, no Windows license is required, so that's going to save you money. You're not going to have to spend however many hundreds of dollars on a Windows Server license just to use with vCenter. Also, no Windows install has to be done, and that's going to save you time. Even better, all the traditional Windows Server third-party applications that most likely go around every Windows server in your infrastructure, none of those have to be installed. Things like antivirus and maybe backup agents and who knows what else you install on every Windows server in your infrastructure. No vCenter Server installation has to be done. Again, that's going to save you time. There's less questions to answer and things to worry about when you perform an installation of the vCSA versus a traditional vCenter Server install in Windows. So deployment is going to be super simple and super fast. Like I said, there's no other faster way to get vCenter up and running other than the vCenter Server Appliance. Now the cons. What are the negatives to using vCenter in this new way? Well, first off, it doesn't yet support SQL Server as an external database. So if you already had Windows, let's say, and you're using SQL as an external database, that's not going to work with the new vCSA. Also, vCenter Server linked mode is not yet compatible. So if you have multiple vCenters in your infrastructure or maybe across your company, you're not going to be able to use linked mode if you use vCenter as an appliance. vCenter Server Heartbeat doesn't work, and the single sign-on feature using Windows session credentials with the vSphere client, that is also not yet compatible. And then finally, the new vSphere Storage Appliance, or the VSA, isn't yet compatible with vCenter if you're using it in the Linux-based appliance mode. So there's some definite pros and cons. To me, the new VSA is ideal for the SMBs and SMEs out there who are very likely not using an external SQL database, not using link mode, not using Heartbeat, and so forth. Now that you know the good and the bad of deploying vCenter Server 5 as an appliance, let's talk about the requirements, the deployment process, and the configuration once it's up. First off, this is going to assume that you already have an installed ESXi server and the vSphere client. If you haven't done that yet, there's other lessons in this course that'll walk you through that process. You'll need to download files from VMware.com that you'll use to import the vCSA. Those files are the .ovf files, the appliance data disk, and the appliance system disk. That appliance system disk is about 4 gigabytes, and honestly, that may be the longest part of this entire process. It's just waiting for that download to complete. So maybe you want to do it one night before you go to bed, and then the next morning you could perform the deployment of the vCSA. And by the way, it isn't just one file that you download. It is indeed multiple files, just like I listed out here. And I think that's because the extreme size of the appliance system disk. They didn't want to put all that in a zip file even if they tried. So once you have those files in the vSphere client, you'll use the deploy OVF option. It's really super simple. I'll walk you through the process here in just a second. It'll deploy the appliance. Of course, it'll copy that 4 gig file from wherever you have it stored up to the ESXi server. So you might want to consider that as well. For example, let's say that you're connected to the virtual infrastructure via a VPN, or you have a slow wireless connection. You might want to just wait until you're back in the data center, you're on the same LAN as the ESXi server, because again, it's going to copy that 4 gig file from wherever you downloaded it and stored it up to the ESXi host. Once the appliance is up and running and powered on, you can log in using the default credentials of root and VMware. From the text-based menu interface on the vCSA console, you can perform basic network and time zone configuration, but by the way, you can also do that over in the graphical web-based interface for the vCSA. So waiting is no problem. You just go to the console and you get the DHCP IP address, then go to the web-based interface and then change the IP address, time zone, and then everything else that we're going to change. You'll want to have the vCSA configured with a static IP address, and of course have a DNS host record on your DNS server pointing to the domain name for the vCSA. Remember, the vCSA is vCenter, and you're going to be connecting to it every time you want to manage your virtual infrastructure using the vSphere client. So you don't want that IP address on the vCSA to be changing at any point. The only absolute steps required to use the vCSA in terms of configuration really is to go to Test and Save on the vCenter database. That'll actually start the vCenter inventory service over on the console. You'll see that happen when you do the Test and Save. And then to start the vCenter services on the vCSA VM. That's it. That's really all you have to do to start using the vCSA. However, there's a number of other recommended configurations I think you should make. Like I said, you should set the static IP address for the vCSA virtual machine. You should set the correct time zone. You should change the root password, of course, for security reasons from VMware. And then I recommend that you configure Windows Active Directory authentication. This is going to make logging in to the vCSA with the vSphere client more like logging in to vCenter that's running on a Windows member server. In other words, you'll be able to log in using your Windows Active Directory credentials. You may want to check out the size of the embedded database to make sure that it matches with the number of hosts that you have in your vSphere infrastructure. And then for good measure, I just recommend that you restart the vCSA virtual machine, although again, that really isn't a requirement. So at this point, let's go over to our vSphere client and let's get started deploying vCenter Server 5 as an appliance, or vCSA. To deploy vCSA, I've connected directly to this ESXi 5 server using the vSphere client. So at this point, we don't have any vCenter server installed. We've just got an ESXi server and the vSphere client. So we're going to use this vSphere client and this ESXi host to deploy the vCSA that we can then use to manage this ESXi server as well as other ESXi hosts in the infrastructure. Deploying the vCSA is easy. You just go up to File, and then down to Deploy OVF Template. That brings up the Deploy OVF Template wizard, and what I'll do here is click Browse, and then I'll browse over to this folder where I stored the files related to the vCSA. Notice that it's searching here for only OVF and OVA packages. I can change this to all files, and you'll actually see here that there are 4 files I've got in this folder related to the vCSA. The vCenter 5 Linux Appliance OVF. There's another OVF file here, and actually one just references the other. Then there's the Virtual Appliance Data Disk, and that's actually the smaller data disk. And then there's the Virtual Appliance System Disk, and that's actually the very large, approximately 4 gigabyte VMware Virtual Disk file. So all 4 of these files were downloaded from VMware.com, but if we just search for OVF packages, we just find the one. So I'm going to click on that one OVF file and click Open, and then click Next. So it finds the vCenter Virtual Appliance. You see version 5.0 there. Download size is about 3 gigs. Size on disk will be about 5.5 gigs if thinly provisioned, or about 80 gigs if thickly provisioned. Again, this is the vCenter Server Linux Virtual Appliance, and it runs on SLES, or SUSE Linux Enterprise Server version 11. So I'll click Next here, and then the default name is VMware vCenter Virtual Appliance. I'm just going to call it vCSA to keep the name short, and click Next. Now it asks where we'd like to store it, and I'll store it out on my iOmega SAN. This is an iSCSI SAN, and it's got about 375 gigs available there. I'll click Next, and I'm going to use the thin provisioning option here so that it doesn't take up as much disk space, and click Next. Of course, for production environments, it's more likely you'd want to use the thickly provisioned option. At this point, we're ready to complete the deployment. I'm going to check here that I want to power it on after deployment automatically. I'll click Finish. Okay, at this point we're deploying the vCSA. As you can see, it's going to take a little while to copy such a large file, the 4 GB application virtual disk, across the network from my local computer up to that ESXi host. So I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as it's completed. With the deployment complete of the new vCenter server virtual appliance and the vCSA already started, you can see it right here. We can click on it. We can tell it's already powered on. Its guest OS is Novell SUSE Linux Enterprise 11 64-bit. It's got 2 vCPUs and it uses 3.6 gigs of memory. It got an IP address here, I'm sure via DHCP. I can tell because that's not an IP address I assigned to it. So it booted up successfully, got an IP address via DHCP, but it still needs some configuration, and of course we want to put a static IP address on it. So to do that, I'm just going to go down here and click on Open Console. So here's what you see when you come to the vCSA console for the first time. You can see this is the VMware vCenter virtual appliance. You see the version, you see the build number, and it says there to manage your appliance, please browse to HTTPS, and it has the IP address there, :5480. So that's the port number you need to use. But what we're going to do is to change the IP address from a dynamic or a DHCP IP address to a static IP address right here using the command line interface. And I should point out this is actually something you can do in the GUI interface as well. So you can do it in either place. And we'll be going to the GUI interface in just a second. We also get a quick start guide there that says to get vCenter server, the virtual appliance, up and running quickly, go to the website, accept the end user license agreement, go to the vCenter server tab, select the database, enter your database connection information, navigate to the vCenter server tab, and click on Start vCenter. So basically what they're saying is, in just a few steps there, you can get vCenter virtual appliance up and running and start using it to manage your virtual infrastructure. And those are the steps that we'll follow here in just a second. But first I want to show you, you can configure the networking here by using the arrow keys. So I'll go down and I'll press Enter on Configure Networking. And then I'm just going to answer a series of questions here related to the networking. So it says, do you want to use a DHCP server instead of a static IP address? The default is yes. I'll say no. And then I'm going to enter my new static IP address, 10.0.1.248. I'll take the default network mask, default gateway. I'm going to change the DNS server to my local DNS server. And then I'll put on a secondary DNS server as well. I'm going to give this a host name of vCSA.wiredbraincoffee.com. A proxy is not necessary to reach the internet. There we get a final confirmation. I'll press Enter and say yes, and then the IP address has been changed on the server. Now we should go over to our DNS server and create a host record for the new vCSA with the new static IP address. So let me go over to my DNS server. Alright, here on my Windows 2008 DNS server here where it says WiredBrain Coffee Company, that's the forward lookup zone. I'm just going to right click and go up to New Host, and I'll type in vCSA, and I'll just quickly enter an IP address here, 10.0.1.248. We added the host. We're done. We've got a host record. And so now let's go back to our vSphere client. Okay, at this point we should be able to use the DNS name that we created to reference the vCenter virtual appliance. I'm going to open my web browser and let's give it a try. Okay, here in my web browser in the address bar, I'm just going to type in https://vCSA:5480. And then we need to accept that we understand the risk here. We'll confirm the SSL security exception. And now here we get a login prompt for the new vCSA in our web browser. So here again, I'll log in as root, and the default password is VMware. I'll click Login. And then just like the quick start guide said, we need to accept the end user license agreement. After accepting the end user license agreement, let's go up here to the vCenter server tab and then down to database. This is our first stop in the vCSA configuration, and it's here that we can choose from the different types of databases that vCSA can use. So we have the option to use the embedded DB2 database. This is already pre-configured, and really all you have to do to make it active is just test it and then click Save Settings. You also have the option to use external databases like Oracle or DB2. Notice that there is no Microsoft SQL external database option at this time. Hopefully that's something that will come later. In our case, we're going to use the embedded database, which actually scales very large, all the way up to 400 hosts or even more. And to do that, all we need to do here is click Test Settings. It says the operation was successful, and I'm just going to click Save Settings to ensure that everything is copacetic here and we're good to go. Okay, again, the operation was successful. Now, something that's optional that you don't have to do, but I recommend that you do, is to go to the Authentication tab and then to Active Directory. Now here, by enabling Active Directory, you can actually make the vCSA function just like your Windows-based vCenter server functions in terms of how you can log in. With Active Directory enabled, you can log in using your Windows username and password just like you do on the vSphere client when you connect to a Windows-based vCenter server. So on the Windows Active Directory, you would create an Active Directory group, and then you would add your vCenter or your virtual infrastructure admins to that group. Of course, you can create other Active Directory groups, and whatever groups you define, then you'll need to go into the vCSA by connecting directly to it using the vSphere client with the root username and password, and then set up those Active Directory groups to be allowed to administer the virtual infrastructure. So I'll be showing you how to do that here in just a minute, but the first thing we want to do is to add our Active Directory information here. In my case, it's the wiredbraincoffeecompany.com, and then the administrator username and password. I'll click Save Settings here. It tells us the operation was successful, and then any change to the Active Directory configuration requires the stop and start of the vCenter server to take effect. Now I'm going to be doing a full reboot here in just a second, but first I want to go over to the vCenter server tab again, and then go into the status, and then notice here that we're using the embedded database and the service status is stopped. So what we're going to do here is to click Start vCenter, and the first time you do this, this might take like a full 1 or 2 minutes. It can take a little bit of time. Okay, now it says our status is running and the operation was successful. At this point, we should be able to log into the vCSA using the default root username and password. But before we do that, I want to give you a brief tour of what the vCSA can do. Then we'll perform a reboot. We'll log in using the root credentials. We'll configure the Active Directory groups. We'll add those to vCenter, and then we'll log in using our Windows Active Directory username and password. So starting from left to right here, you see the vCenter server tab, you saw the end user license agreement, you saw the status tab, you saw the databases section here. Let's go into settings, and inside settings, this is where you can tell the vCSA the approximate size of your virtual infrastructure so that it can optimize itself for that type of environment. It says that a small inventory is less than 100 hosts and a large inventory is over 400. So that tells you how much the vCSA can scale. It's not just for small and medium-sized businesses. It can scale to virtual infrastructures that have over 400 hosts. So it's here that you would reconfigure that and then save settings. We can go into administration here, and currently the default root password, it says administrator password, but the default root password is VMware. And that's definitely something you want to change. So here I'll type in VMware as the current administrator password, and then I'll set my own administrator password. I'll click Change Password here, and it says the operation was successful. Notice you can also connect to the vCSA using SSH, and that can be enabled or disabled from here. It's actually enabled by default. Now let's go up here to the tabs, and we'll start with the Services tab. Here you can see the status of the vCenter services, and you can also do start and stop from here. So we've got ESXi syslog. That's right, vCSA can be used as a syslog server for your ESXi host. It also supports network core dumps, and it also supports ESXi auto deploy. So we've got another lesson in this course on auto deploy, and the vCSA is compatible with that. And by the way, the vCSA also provides the vSphere web client server portion. So you don't have to install something separate on your Windows server to support the new vSphere web client. You can actually use the web client as long as you're using the vCSA, and it's automatically running and installed by default. From here you can look at the syslog services, you can look at the net dump information and the auto deploy information. And then now let's go up to the authentication tab. You can see the status of the authentication. From here we've enabled Active Directory. We're not using NIS. We can go to network, and it's here that you can configure the IP address underneath address. You can actually use this instead of the text-based console that we used to configure a static IP address for the vCSA. If I go to system, it tells you information about the vCSA, and it's here that you can reboot or shut down the vCSA. You can also configure the time zone for the vCSA from here, which is something I recommend you do. Let's see, in my case, I'm in America and Eastern Time. There we go. I'll click Save Settings here, and we configure the time zone. We can also go to Update, and this Update tab and the settings associated with it, this is actually where you would configure the vCSA to check for updates automatically and even to download updates automatically to the vCSA. It's really cool in the sense that you don't have to download vCenter manually and then do the install. It can actually keep itself updated. If we go into Upgrade, the Upgrade tab is actually where you would perform a manual upgrade. So you would download the new version of the vCSA, then you would perform a manual import through this interface to upgrade the vCSA. Alright, so that's all the different tabs across the top. At this point, let's go ahead and go into System, and I'm just going to click Reboot. I'll say yes, I want to reboot the vCSA. And it says please wait for the system to reboot, or click Cancel to log out immediately. Let's go over to the vCSA console. And here you can see that vCSA is actually rebooting. I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as it's back up and running. With the new vCSA successfully configured and restarted, we can now connect to it using our vSphere client. Since I configured a DNS record for the IP address here, I can just type vCSA, and then the first time I connect, I need to log in as root so that I can configure my Windows Active Directory vSphere administrative group to map to the vCenter administrative role using the vSphere client. So the first time we'll connect, we'll do it as root. I'll click Login here. I'll go ahead and accept the standard security warnings or ignore those. And here we go. We successfully connected to our new vCenter server that's running as a virtual appliance. On the top here, you can see the host name, vCSA, and it's VMware vCenter Server version 5. So from here, the first thing I really want to do is to go into permissions. And by default here, I just have the root administrator group. So what we want to do so that we can enable Active Directory users to log in who are part of our vSphere administrative group over in Active Directory is we'll right-click right here, we'll go into Add Permission, we'll click Add to add users and groups, and then look at the domain here. So the domain by default is server, which is all the local Linux-based logins. I'm going to do the drop-down here, and here's my Active Directory domain, Wired Brain Coffee. That brings up a list of Active Directory users and groups over on my domain controller. But so far we haven't set up that group I was talking about. So now let me go over to my Active Directory domain controller and let's actually create that group. Here on my Active Directory domain controller, I'm just going to go to Administrative Tools and then open up Active Directory Users and Computers. From here we'll right-click inside Users, I'll go to New, and we'll create a new group. This is going to be a global security group. The group name is going to be vSphere Admins. I'll click OK here. And then let's open up the user David Davis. Actually, let's double check my login name, and it is David at wiredbraincoffee.com. So I'm going to go to the Member Of tab here, and I'm going to add, and then we'll add vSphere admin. So now I'm going to be a member of the vSphere admins group. So unlike whenever you install vCenter over on a Windows server that's a member server and part of that Active Directory domain, where the Active Directory administrators group by default has administrative access to the virtual infrastructure, that does not happen with the vCSA. So that's why you have to do this. Of course, you could add the administrators group over in the vSphere client and effectively have the same thing. But I think a best practice would be to just create a new vSphere admins group and then add whatever users you want from the Active Directory to be members of that vSphere admins group. That way you have a specific group with a specific name, not just every Windows Active Directory administrator. So we have our vSphere admins group. I am now a member of that group. I'll click OK here. So now let's go back to our vSphere client. And to get this list to refresh here, I'm just going to go back to Server, then back to Active Directory. Let's sort this by name, so it should be in alphabetical order. I'll scroll down. There's our vSphere admins group. So I'm going to click on that, say OK here. Notice it added WiredBrain Coffee / vSphere admins. Of course, I could have just added David if I wanted to do that right there. I could have just added David. But let's assume we have an enterprise here. We're going to have multiple vSphere admins. We want to be able to add and remove those from that Active Directory group to determine who can administer the virtual infrastructure. So we've got a group here. That makes sense. I'll say OK. So now we've got a group. The role by default is read-only. Let's change that role to administrator. So the WiredBrain Coffee group called vSphere admins will have administrative access to the virtual infrastructure. I'll say OK there. We now have this added. So now let's go ahead and close out our vSphere client. And now let's reopen it. And then this time we're going to connect to the vCSA, but this time I'll log in as David. I'll type my Windows Active Directory username and password there and click Login. And what do we get? We get cannot complete login due to an incorrect username and password. Well, we didn't mess up on our configuration. Unlike a vCenter server that's installed on a Windows server, part of a Windows Active Directory domain, in this case, when you're connecting to vCSA that's using Windows Active Directory authentication, you have to put in the domain. So I'm going to put in @wiredbraincoffee.com and click Login. And there we go. I successfully connected to the vCSA, and you can see down on the very bottom right-hand corner here, I'm logged in as WiredBrain Coffee / David. And in fact, I could have entered my domain name just like that, or my username just like that, WiredBrain Coffee / David. You can do it that way or the way I did it, which was David at wiredbraincoffee.com. So now we have our brand new vCSA here that you can use to manage the virtual infrastructure. There's a few things you might want to do. For example, we could go to the vCenter server settings, and we can go down to runtime settings, and I'm going to name our vCenter server. I'll call it vCSA.wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll say OK here. We see the name now. We can add some data centers. I'll call this Hilton Head, South Carolina. And then right-click and add your ESXi servers from there. So now we've got a working vCenter server virtual appliance up and running. And with that, let's go back to our slides. So what did we learn in this lesson? Well, we started off by answering the question, what is the vCenter Server Appliance? It's a new way to deploy vCenter Server 5, and it's the fastest and easiest way to deploy it. I talked about how this is going to save you from having to purchase a Windows Server license, and it's also going to save you a lot of time installing Windows Server and installing vCenter. However, I also mentioned that there's a number of features like vCenter Server Link Mode and vCenter Server Heartbeat, as well as the new vSA, or the vSphere Storage Appliance, that aren't yet compatible with the vCSA. From there, I walk you through deploying the new vCSA by using the Deploy OVF option in the vSphere client. We configure the new vCSA through the text-based console, adding things like a static IP address, and then we tested out vCSA using the vSphere client to prove that it works, so that you can see it is an almost fully functional version of vCenter Server 5. Thanks for watching this lesson covering installing VMware vCenter 5 as a Linux appliance.